أنا معاوية فيصل صياصنة، مواليد ال94. كنت أنا وسامر علي صياصنة وأحمد ثاني رشيدات. فترة من الزمن بال 2011 حط النظام عندنا كولابات للشرطة. حرقنا الكولبة أول شيء وكتبنا عبارات إنه إجاك الدور يا دكتور وحرية ويسقط النظام. لهالشيء هذا كتبنا انه حريه ويسقط النظام. بشار الاسد انه كان دكتور، كتبنا عباره جاك الدور يا دكتور.
"2011 was the year of revolutions. The Arab Spring had taken the region by storm. The dictators of Tunisia and Egypt had already fallen. Little did Muawiyah and his friends know that their small act of protest would soon spark a nationwide uprising.
اعتقلنا أنا وأصحابي. كانت يعني التقينا بالسجون لمدة 45 يوم. كانت طرق تعذيب بصراحة ما كناش نتحملها، اللي هي الشبح على الحيطان وصدمات الكهرباء واكثر من طريقه تعذيب. يعني كان بده يعرف انه مين اللي حرضنا او مين اللي كان ورانا او مين اللي يعني دفشنا على الشيء هذا. بصراحه ما كانش حدا يعني محرضنا او حدا دافشنا. كنا نشوف مظاهرات من مصر وتونس لهيك كتبنا هاي العبارات. اهالينا طالبت فينا كثير يعني، ويعني يعني الناس اهالينا طالبت فينا وحطت واسطات. توجه كلام بذيء لاهالينا انه انسوا اطفالكم، واذا ما نسيتوهم انه جيبوا مسوانكم. احنا بنقولها شلون نجيبها اطفال غيرينا.
Not only the kids' families, all people of Daraa felt insulted.
هون اهل حوران شغله العرض والشرف خط احمر. صارت مظاهرات طالب الاطفال. طلعنا تفاجأنا لما طلعنا من السجون انه اهل حوران بالكامل مظاهرات يعني حامله اغصان زيتون وطالب حريه وبدنا المعتقلين الاطفال عننا. طلعنا يعني تفاجأنا بصراحه انه اهلنا وناسنا بتطالب فينا.
The events in Daraa triggered a major uprising. On the 15th of March 2011, protesters marched in Damascus and Aleppo, demanding democratic reforms and the release of political prisoners.
This is a massive, horrific regime that has stood on people's chests for 61 years and have ruled in a way that no other Arab or other countries have ruled their people. And so people revolted.
The response from Bashar al-Assad's regime was brutal. Security forces opened fire on the protesters. As the unrest spread across Syria, hundreds were killed, arrested, or tortured.
It was a revolution, an uprising of the oppressed. And when people were faced with weapons, with barrel bombs, with airstrikes that indiscriminately forced those who serve the military, who are supposed to serve the people and who are supposed to protect the borders, started attacking civilians.
Just a few months into the unrest, the situation in Syria took an irrevocable turn.
This is when Hussein Harmoush, the officer in the Syrian army, and a few others started this movement to resist and to bear arms and defect out of the regime's armed military and stand with the people and protect civilians.
The formation of the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, marked the beginning of the armed rebellion against the Assad regime. Other groups followed suit. With the rise of armed rebel militias across Syria, the fighting became widespread.
In the beginning, it was an armed self-defense, and then later became an armed resistance against the regime, and then became an offensive to take out this regime because it's not rehabilitable. It's not a regime that is capable to become better or to learn or to behave and change behavior. And this is proven throughout the years.
The turmoil in Syria was felt across the region. It inflicted both security risks and a humanitarian burden upon its neighbors. One of those neighboring countries, Türkiye, shares its longest border with Syria. Both were part of the Ottoman Empire, and the two countries had remained inextricably linked through geographic and historical ties. However, relations between Ankara and Damascus have been complex. Syria's claim of the Turkish border province of Hatay after the fall of the Ottoman Empire was followed by the country's support of the PKK terror organization, a grave security concern for modern Türkiye.
Turkey's relations with Syria were always difficult, especially because the Assad regime, the father Hafez al-Assad's regime, hosted terror groups in the Bekaa Valley, and PKK was one of them. PKK, as you know, has been a national security threat for Turkey for more than 40 years, and that was a very toxic relationship. When Hafez al-Assad passed away, his son replaced him, Bashar al-Assad, and that was seen by the international community, especially by Turkey at the time, as a new opportunity for an opening.
I was in Damascus, first assumed my duties. There were the opening stages of the improved relations, and during my course of time there, about 4.5 years, it steadily improved, intensified. We had many visits, many events, and also we worked on the free trade agreement, which is, attached to the EU rules, but we took precedence against the EU, and we had the agreement. Those were the main milestones during my time there. It was completely positive agenda. When I say the positive agenda, it doesn't mean that the fundamental problems that we had, the historical ones, were solved. No, it wasn't. They weren't. But that was the approach between Turkey and Syria, to focus on the positive agenda with the expectation or desire that when time comes, the atmosphere is convenient, those problems could have been tackled.
The two neighboring countries' complicated relationship was further strained by the uprising. Since the early days, Turkey has been one of the most vocal nations in the world against Bashar al-Assad over his violent crackdown on the protests.
Büyük ihtimalle Perşembe günü temsilcilerimiz orada olacaklar. Kendileriyle görüşecekler. Özellikle totaliter, dayatmacı bir yapının olmasını asla arzu etmiyoruz, beklemiyoruz.
This regime gave up so many opportunities to concede, to give concessions, to give political reforms. Many countries, including Turkey, intervened and tried to persuade Bashar al-Assad to give in at least some symbolic. He refused even the symbolic giveaways and insisted that these people can only be ruled by crushing their bones in the bone crushing machine inside Naya prison and other prisons.
When Ankara's diplomatic attempts hit a dead end, Turkey joined a number of other countries demanding Assad step down.
Zulm ile aba dolunmaz, halkının üzerine tankla, topla saldıranların iktidarda kalması da mümkün olmayacaktır. Dolayısıyla bizim Beşar'a yönelik yaklaşımımız artık bir ay öncesi yaklaşım değildir. 2 ay öncesi yaklaşım değildir. Ve bütün bu olaylardan sonra bunun hesabını vermek durumunda kalacaktır.
Neighboring countries, Türkiye, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, were soon inundated with refugees fleeing the conflict. On April 29, 2011, the first group of Syrian refugees arrived in Hatay province in Turkey's southeast.
I was there in Hatay when the first Syrian families were crossing the border, and now still I'm in Turkish Red Crescent responding to the evolving needs in Syria. Turkish nation shared the space with Syrian communities. The space, not just the physical space, but the space in the labor market, the space in education, the space in health system.
At first, the world believed that their displacement would be short-term, but by the end of 2011, the number of Syrian refugees reached 14,000, then increased to 224,000 by late 2012.
Savaş bir kitlesel göçü aslında harekete geçirdi. Yani bir doğal afetten kaçmakla bir savaştan kaçmak çok farklı. Doğal afetten sonra afetin bitimiyle beraber birazcık daha yapılanma süreçlerine odaklanır. İyileşmeyle beraber yuvanıza dönmek için uygun koşulları beklersiniz ama Suriye'deki yaşanan olaylar bu kadar kısa süreli bir geri dönüşü zemin oluşturabilecek bir altyapısı yoktu.
Turkey introduced an open door policy towards Syrian refugees.
In my experience, the quality of life for Syrian refugees in Turkey was comparatively a lot higher than in Lebanon, and probably slightly higher than in Jordan too. What struck me is the West or Europe's sort of outsourced their moral responsibility when it came to refugees, to Turkey. And I don't think they got the support they deserved from the international community. I think Turkey was very, very generous and very, very welcoming to Syrian refugees. It's comparative, especially to Lebanon and other countries. And I don't think Europe did enough. It was, you know, I'm sure we all remember the footage of Alan Kurdi who washed up on that beach, that heartbreaking image. And I think that had an impact across the West, where people said, "Oh, do you know, we should be doing more. We should be taking in more refugees." But that quickly evaporated, and it went back to that sort of xenophobia, quite isolationist of, "No, we don't want refugees." So they very much did just outsource the problem to Turkey. And yeah, I really don't believe that Turkey were given the support we probably deserved for their generosity.
By the 15th of July 2012, at least 16,000 people had been killed in Syria. This led the International Committee of the Red Cross to declare the conflict a civil war.
I think I have great reservations on the label that many analysts give to Syria as a civil war. This was a popular revolution. Revolutions have two types, non-violent and violent. It started a non-violent movement, a grassroots movement of all walks of life in Syria that revolted against a regime that is unprecedented.
The threat of war spilling over into neighboring countries was imminent. Tensions between Turkey and Syria worsened significantly after Syrian regime forces shot down a Turkish fighter jet in June 2012. Border clashes followed in October. Syrian mortar shells started to land on Turkey's Hatay province. In addition to the regime's cross-border attacks, the YPG was also operating in northern Syria right across the Turkish border. The YPG is the Syrian affiliate of the PKK, which has been designated a terrorist organization in Turkey, the US, and EU.
After 2011, the civil conflict caused a huge turmoil in Syrian territory, and as a result of this conflict, there was a vacuum, power vacuum within the country, and this vacuum was just in the following period tried to be filled up by some terrorist organizations. Then these terrorist organizations turned out to be threat against Turkey as well, and we experienced some, for example, mortar attacks to bordering provinces like in Kilis, for example, the schools were bombed by mortars or some missiles or rockets, etc. And we lost some of the teachers, students.
The war in Syria was raging with accusations the Syrian regime was using chemical weapons. On August 20th, 2012, then US President Barack Obama called the use of chemical weapons a red line.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
The red line had been crossed many times before. Nothing could prevent what happened next. In the early hours of the 21st of August 2013, just a year after Obama's speech, the Assad regime struck 2 opposition-controlled areas in the suburbs around Damascus. The rockets contained the chemical agent sarin. Estimates of the number killed ranged from at least 281 people to 1,729. Despite international calls for action, once again, the Assad regime faced no consequences.
The Obama administration's policy, which was typical of many American presidents, was maximalist, overthrow Assad with minimal, we say skin in the game, with minimal effort, minimal putting in forces and that kind of thing, and the result was a very confused policy. He should have worked more closely with the Arab states and Türkiye to bring all of the opposition forces together. He should have obviously, as Trump did, respond militarily on the use of chemical weapons. And thirdly, he should have acted against Russia when it came in 2015 by upping all kinds of pressure instead of just ignoring it and saying Russia would be in a quagmire.
Both the US and Turkey had national security interests at stake in Syria, but those interests weren't always aligned. Ankara was unhappy about Washington's unwillingness to help the opposition to topple the Assad regime.
We sort of had a palliative approach to Syria itself, saying we'll provide humanitarian assistance, we'll try to curb drug trafficking and so forth, but we can't solve and don't have a theory about how to solve the problem that drove the civil war, which was Assad's oppression of his own people. We essentially declined to have an affirmative policy on that.
America's influence in Syria was limited, and its NATO ally Türkiye was a powerful partner in the region. From the Turkish perspective, the US policy was ambiguous and did not have a clear picture.
What are the outcomes going to be? What if Assad falls? Could something be worse than Assad? Personally, my assessment is it's hard to be worse than Assad, a man who's killed 500,000 of his own citizens or been responsible for their deaths, who operated industrial scale death camps, basically the prison camps, Sednaya and others, who barrel bombed his own cities, who enabled Iran to become a regional hegemon through its proxy network, who ran a drug-based economy through Captagon, and was no friend to the West, to the United States, or to his neighbors. It's hard to be worse than that. So I, from the beginning, came down on the side that said the revolution should be supported. Now, how you do that? Is it political support, intelligence support, military support? Those are discussions over modalities. But the fact is, after initially saying that Assad must step down under President Obama's administration and providing substantive support to the armed opposition, the United States stopped that and essentially sort of made peace with the idea that Assad would stay forever.
In the beginning of the conflict, opposition forces had the momentum. They captured the regional capitals of Raqqa in 2013 and Idlib in 2015. However, in 2014, Iran launched a military intervention in support of the Assad regime. Russia followed in Assad's rescue in 2015, shifting the balance of the conflict.
And over time, these military engagements increased in quality. And we have seen in the next phase that this dichotomy between the opposition and the Assad regime evolved into a much more multifaceted conflict. So the second stage of the Syrian conflict was that we had multiple different actors with different goals in Syria.
But an unlikely force would change the war's dynamics forever. In 2014, Daesh, or ISIS, a designated terror organization originating from Iraq, surfaced in Syria, further deteriorating the situation on the ground.
We had the PKK Syrian branch, we had the Al-Nusra Front at ISIS in Syria, the Syrian opposition divided into the more Islamic leaning and the Free Syrian Army, and the Assad regime together with its militias. So this made the conflict from a dichotomy into a multiple-faceted conflict. And it did not end there. The conflict got even more complicated due to the foreign intervention.
Daesh fought both the rebel factions and the Syrian regime. They were able to seize control of large parts of eastern Syria and western Iraq.
This is where the international coalition started in and focused only on removing the aftermath and not the true cause of terrorism, which was the regime of Bashar al-Assad. That a lot of these fighters, they grew up in the prisons of Bashar al-Assad. A lot of them have been trained in the prisons of Bashar al-Assad. And so they later on established this transactional and transnational both group called ISIS that really has nothing close to being Islamic and nothing close to being humanistic even, and really changed the course, meaning the regime used this to change the narrative and the discourse to be that he was a poor victim under the attack of extremist terrorism, and that waved a flag to threaten regional stability.
A US-led coalition composed of military forces and personnel from over 30 countries was formed in October of 2014 to counter the threat. Washington launched an aerial bombing campaign against Daesh while providing ground support and supplies to the SDF, which was an attempt to rebrand the YPG terror organization.
They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them that, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces.
The United States of America had one main criteria, and this criteria was that they wanted a local partner for us in Syria to fight ISIS and who is willing to accept not to fight the Assad regime anymore. And all of the moderate Syrian opposition rejected this criteria, as they argued that they have to fight Assad in order to defeat ISIS as well. And the only one who accepted this Obama criteria was the YPG, the PKK Syrian branch. And so the US basically took over the proxy of Iran and Russia and has worked with them in Syria, even though it risked relations with Türkiye.
Despite being part of the US-led coalition, Ankara was against Washington's support of the YPG-led SDF over other groups in the fight against Daesh. One of the main concerns for Turkish policy in Syria has been the role of the PKK's Syrian branch, YPG, which were now receiving significant financial and arms support from the US.
It also impacted Turkish-American relations in a big way, because America started supporting the YPG in the context of the Kobani fight in 2014, the fall of 2014. So basically what happened is that Turkey ended up, because of the Syrian crisis, having to deal with terrorism, PKK terrorism, but also ISIS terrorism along its border, and a rogue regime that was corrupt regime that was trying to kill its own people, and all the instability that it created, millions of refugees, displaced people, that also threatened the security of Europe.
For Turkey, PKK is a critical issue. And when an ally, and the ally actually, United States, entered into an open engagement with PKK, of course that adversely, very negatively affects the alliance relationship between Turkey and the United States. Not only United States, also Europe, but that was an ongoing problem from maybe the beginning of the PKK problem, terror problem. Turkey did not receive the earnest, the sincere support that it was expecting from its allies.
In the meantime, on the ground, a fierce battle was raging. Once a vibrant, historic capital, Aleppo was now a significant opposition stronghold and the front line of the biggest battle of the revolution.
I am Anas Arfan. I'm 35 years old. I'm originally from Aleppo city, which is in the north. I remember that when the revolution started, I was like 21 years old, full of passion, full of compassion, having big dreams, to be honest. And then the revolution started. It was started like basically seeking for freedom, seeking for the freedom of speech, to have more rights, to be more involved in the politics, to have equal rights among us and all Syrians. Then in 2014, I had to flee from Aleppo because of the situation was very bad. The places all around Aleppo were bombed by the Assad regime, and also I had the military service that if they catch you, they will take you and send you to the front lines to kill your own brothers and to kill your own family. So this is why I had to flee from Aleppo in 2014, and I moved to Turkey.
Between 2012 and 2016, Syria's largest and most populous province had suffered indiscriminate attacks and widespread violence against civilians. Intense fighting led to a massive influx of refugees from Aleppo into Türkiye.
Türkiye'ye geçiş yapan insanların ihtiyaçlarını gidermek adına en başta da söylediğimiz sıcak yemek hizmetlerinin verilmesi, barınma imkanlarının oluşturulması gibi faaliyetler yürütüldü. Bu tabii ki sadece sınırın ötesine geçebilen insanlar olduğu gibi sizin de bahsettiğiniz içeride kalan geçenden daha fazla insan vardı ve bu insanlar evlerini terk ettiler. Yanlarında getirdikleri hiçbir şeyleri yoktu.
In July 2016, the regime's forces, supported by Russian airstrikes, closed the rebels' last supply line into Aleppo. People were deprived of basic needs. Forced starvation was used as a weapon. Chemical attacks, indiscriminate strikes with cluster munitions and barrel bombs on populated areas by Russian and the regime forces became the reality. They are also illegal under international law.
I got into the sector, the humanitarian aid sector, in response to what was happening in Aleppo, seeing just brutality and inhumanity at such horrific scale. It seemed so dystopian to me that there'd be a country on earth where a government would be doing this to its own people.
Rebel forces were unable to break the siege. By December, the Syrian regime had captured all of Aleppo. It was a turning point in Syria's civil war and would forever be remembered as the mother of battles.
مباشرة بعد سقوط حلب، وهنا أدركت القيادة التركية أنه إذا لم تدخل في مفاوضات سياسية وعسكرية بعيدة المدى فإن الثورة السورية وهي الحليف القوي لتركيا سوف تخسر المعركة، ثم سينجم عن ذلك مزيد من اللاجئين وكثير من المشكلات، وأيضا ستزداد مشاكل قسد باعتبار أن الولايات المتحدة كانت قد تبنت مشروع قسد في مواجهة داعش، وتضمن هذا المشروع أيضا التمكين لهم في الأرض. أنا تقديري أن هذه الأسباب الثلاثة التي دفعت تركيا إلى بدء التفاوض.
There had been several attempts to find a diplomatic solution to the Syrian conflict over the years. The first peace talks were launched by the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland in 2012. Another attempt was made in 2014. By 2015, Assad began consolidating his position with backing from both Russia and Iran. He refused to discuss the constitutional process and presidential elections. With the Geneva talks failing, Iran excluded, and Türkiye at odds with America over its support of the YPG, a new channel emerged.
Turkey's position from the start was, or very shortly after the start, because initially President Erdogan, then Prime Minister Erdogan, was trying to talk Assad into treating his own people a little more decently. That was a different approach. But as soon as he understood that it was barrel bombs that would talk for Assad, the Turkish state took on a very consistent policy stance, which would be to support the opposition politically, allow refugees to come into Turkey, push for multilateral negotiations to end the war and to force an agreement upon Assad that would respect the rights of his people.
In January 2017, a brand new peace process was launched between Russia, Türkiye, and Iran in the Kazakh capital of Astana.
Actually, it was a historical process. There was a lot of things done to bring stability to Syria without any revolution. I believe that many people may think the same, that evolution anyway is better than revolution. But at the end of the game, from the Syria side, it was expected there will be some political reforms, there will be new elections, and there will be somehow the policy of Damascus, which will involve all the players in the political process in Syria, which could actually save Syria from another revolution. And Bashar Assad had a historical chance actually to perform it.
The Astana talks brought the strongest opposition groups on the ground together and made them sit with the regime for the first time since the beginning of the war.
The fact that Russia, Turkey, and Iran was at the same negotiation table doesn't mean that they were allies or they were fully agree with each other. But somehow they tried to find a compromise.
Astana yielded more results than the Geneva talks as the three guarantor countries, Iran, Russia, and Türkiye, agreed on de-escalation zones in a bid to stop the violence in mainly opposition-held areas.
بعد 4 جلسات طرحت أول خريطة لتخفيض التصعيد. طرحت 4 مناطق. المنطقة الأولى في درعا وما حولها، والثانية في ريف دمشق والغوطة، والمنطقة الثالثة في ريف حمص، والمنطقة الرابعة في إدلب ومناطق من حما.
Even though the agreement reduced the violence temporarily, it could not be fully implemented. The Syrian regime was continuing its airstrikes even on the designated de-escalation areas. Türkiye and Russia took the lead in using their leverage over the opposition and the regime, respectively.
The United States has been supporting the terror group in northern Syria, so Turkey has been able to navigate the political implications of that. One of the things it has done is to actually have military presence on the ground, support the opposition, and engage Iran and Russia through the Astana process, so that things are relatively manageable on the ground, but also that YPG does not, get a larger portion of the of northern Syria.
Meanwhile, the US-backed SDF, a YPG-dominated ground force, became the main tool of the US-led coalition's fight against Daesh. The activities of the Daesh terror organization were not only posing the greatest challenge to bringing the war to an end, but also to world stability. Between June 2014 and February 2018, the group claimed responsibility for over 140 terrorist attacks across 29 countries outside Syria and Iraq.
Even the Russians were afraid of ISIS reaching it, the West, Europe, etc., especially with refugees. This was a major risk for many countries, and it unfortunately pushed countries to narrow down their focus to be solely focused on how do we counter ISIS instead of how do we counter the true source of instability and insecurity.
Having two notorious terror organizations, Daesh and YPG, operating so close to its borders, Ankara's concern for its own national security was growing. In Türkiye, at least 300 people were killed and more than 1,300 other people were injured in at least 8 different Daesh attacks. Ankara also wanted to stop the flow of Daesh fighters from abroad entering Syria over its own borders.
Bakın bu sabah 4 itibariyle Suriye'nin kuzeyinde sürekli ülkemizi oradan tehdit eden DAEŞ, PYD gibi terör örgütlerine yönelik bir operasyonu ordumuz başlatmış durumda. Güvenlik güçlerimiz başlatmış durumda.
Between 2016 and 2019, Turkey launched 3 direct military operations inside Syria. Ankara's first move was on the 24th of August 2016, Operation Euphrates Shield in the northern Aleppo countryside. The second was Operation Olive Branch in Afrin on the 20th of January 2018. And the third, Operation Peace Spring, came in the northern Raqqa countryside, western Al-Hasaka, on the 9th of October 2019. Turkey targeted the Daesh and YPG terror groups, aiming to create a buffer zone between the conflict and its borders while preventing the establishment of a terror corridor along its frontier.
We understand Turkish concerns very much clear. Territorial integrity of Turkey actually is in danger when such groups are active in any neighboring countries like PKK or Daesh, whatever. So it is widely accepted that Turkey participated in a fight with the terror. There is no different view from the Russian side.
The PYD PKK had enjoyed a significant presence in Afrin since mid-2012, when Syrian regime forces withdrew from the area without a fight. It lies close to the Turkish border.
امج سال 2050 امج گند خودر کتن پاکا که هیرش گند کرد ما گند خو مال خو ما هیچ تو هم در کتن ام چول رابو پاکا که هات مال ما بر فابریقه ما بر خانه ما بر جی دواره مالی دار ما همو قد کرن کور ما برن یعنی کتر بیم کریه ما دی صابرن از پاکی منی بچوک هبو دی صابرن او ملاتی گند برن قیزک برن، شباب برن، گی توخوا کرن، گی رزیل کرن همو ظلم و زور وان سرملتی ما بود حوال شورش هم تو شورش مشهر کردن یهوجی ناخوازن اون کردن و خواهین مد یخی ما رجیم اسد ظلم خال سر ما بود و قصصال و هم د دیوان را بود و على اساس اون جی د جیوانن بس درکت اون نه د جیوانن اون حوال ایوانن.
Turkey's second intervention, Operation Olive Branch, lasted 58 days and eventually cleared the YPG from Afrin.
وهين جهانا كان عند عردتنا ذاتي امليفينا فريقك ورا وان بومبانا روكا باق بكا لاني بن سري وان بومبانا ده مريك رحمتي بو وسسي كاتنا مستشفى يكي دست خوقت بو يكي تشوفي خوچو يكي لنجي خوچو هن دركتور خوزاتي هن الجي هن الجي كأوبوي بومبا فجري والله دار ما بري هبون بس دار ما قهل كرنا حتى في داريونا كينو كوفر سبيعبو يعني ميوة تربون حتى هول كرنا حتى شمسها بو معني هو ديلي ترى صار هاوجي قد كرنا رو كرنا وإن شاء الله ما ديسو تشيكن ما ديسو هونين شتل عم كديسو بتشينا ديسو حياة كبايدو يعني حياة ناس كنا.
Turkey's military intervention made it possible for hundreds of thousands of Syrians who had to flee the violence to finally return home.
And there was no any other option. So Turkey started a series of military operations, created at least from the border area till the 30 kilometers, which is outside the artillery or mortar range, created some safe zones, and also in these safe zones tried to construct such kind of a public administration which is similar to Turkey itself, which will maintain the survival of the Syrians in their own territory, and which will also motivate those who want to return to their homeland. So this kind of useful, suitable conditions for those who might return tried to be conducted and created in those areas. And that just, I think, turned out to be a model for all over the Syria as well.
By late 2017, Daesh was largely defeated. In December 2018, US President Donald Trump, in his first term, announced US troops involved in the fight against Daesh in northeast Syria would be withdrawn immediately.
When I was special representative, our policy was to freeze the conflict, work with Türkiye, Israel, the Arab states, the various opposition forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the international community and the UN, first to resolve the conflict under 2250 UN Resolution 2254, ensure the total defeat of Daesh or ISIS, and very importantly, eliminate all Iranian forces and influence in Syria. That was the strategic goal. I believe that while we didn't achieve that goal during those 2 years, 2018, 2020, what we did do with the help of Türkiye and other countries was to freeze the conflict, civil war. So there was almost no fighting by mid-2020, and that stayed the course. The Biden administration was not enthusiastic about Syria. They didn't have the same strategic view that the Trump administration did. The good news is that they followed, not with enthusiasm, a particular leadership, what we had done in the Trump administration, and that was enough.
On October 27, 2019, US President Donald Trump announced the death of Daesh leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He had killed himself during an overnight raid by US Special Forces in Syria.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He was the founder and leader of ISIS, the most ruthless and violent terror organization anywhere in the world.
We saw that in his first Trump administration, he wanted to get out of Syria. He felt like we have nothing to fight for here. But CENTCOM, American military Pentagon, convinced him that fighting against ISIS was still ongoing. He needed to declare victory against ISIS. Otherwise, he would look weak, I guess. Also, leaving Syria for Iran and Russia was not an option for him. And he seems to have been sort of convinced on those points. But at the same time, he was also convinced by President Erdogan's arguments that, this organization, YPG, was simply PKK's Syrian branch. And their justification of fighting against ISIS was not a strong enough justification. First of all, their capacity was not up to par. Without American air support, without American military, this wasn't a group that was going to fight ISIS on its own.
The world's focus on fighting Daesh had worked to the regime's advantage. By late 2018, all rebel strongholds except parts of Idlib had fallen to government forces. The Syrian regime was determined to move into Idlib, attacking areas under Turkish army control. In February 2020, Ankara announced the launch of Operation Spring Shield, the fourth military intervention by Turkish forces. The operation was in retaliation to the Syrian regime's attack on Turkish soldiers and to halt the regime's advances towards Idlib. The United States and NATO supported Turkey's move.
وهي بعد قرار النظام السوري باستئصال الثورة السورية بأكملها في شهر يناير 2020، وهنا تدخلت القوات التركية عسكريا وقامت بضرب النظام ودمرت 14% من قوته العسكرية، وهنا أجبر النظام السوري على توقيع اتفاق مهم جدا. على تقديري كان هو أهم اتفاق، وهو اتفاق تثبيت خطوط التماس والسعي نحو وقف إطلاق النار ومعالجة الانتهاكات.
On the 5th of March 2020, the presidents of Türkiye and Russia met in Moscow and agreed on a regional ceasefire. The three-point agreement included the creation of a 12-kilometer safety corridor along the country's crucial M4 highway.
I mean, Turkey took in at least 4 million refugees. And so let's say this is probably the biggest burden that any country has taken in the region. In terms of a number, in terms of the amount of inflow within a short period. Turkey has also suffered a lot from the destability of its borders to Syria, the investments that had to be done to secure its borders.
Turkey had been a center for aid delivery into northwest Syria since 2014, mainly through its Bab al-Hawa crossing. The humanitarian corridor was authorized by the UN Security Council. Towards the end of the war, the corridor had become the only lifeline for millions of Syrians trapped in northwest Syria.
80 bin tırlık bir insani yardım malzemesinin insanlara ulaştığı bir süreçten bahsediyoruz. Burada 80 bin tır çok yüksek bir rakam. Yani milyonlarca insanın sırtında kazak, akşam evinde yemek, evindeki bir elektrikli ihtiyaç, malzeme ihtiyacının giderilmesi, belki hastanelerde kullanılan tıbbi cihazlar olarak bunların hepsini somut olarak gördük. Yani 80 bin tır basit, çok kısa söylenebiliyor ama bunun arkasında milyonlarca bağışçı, milyonlarca yararlanıcı, binlerce saat mesai, gidilmiş kilometrelerce yol, aşılmış denizler, süreçler var. O da Kızılay olarak bizim sınır yardımları programı olarak adlandırdığımız ve bu işin mihenk taşlarından, temel taşlarından biri olan, operasyonun da yürümesindeki temel noktalardan biri olan bir projeydi.
As of 2023, active fighting in the conflict between the Syrian regime and rebel groups had mostly subsided, but there were occasional flare-ups in the northwest. Daesh had been defeated, with only a few cells remaining in various remote locations. Turkey was continuing its support for the Syrian National Army, the new name of the Free Syrian Army. Starting on the 5th of October 2023, the Turkish armed forces launched a series of air and ground strikes targeting the YPG in northeastern Syria. The airstrikes were launched in response to the 2023 Ankara bombing carried out by the terror group.
Turkey never said that Turkey will invade the areas. Turkey always see that as a temporary issue until the unification of the country is constructed and the security is totally secured in those areas. So that's why I think both at the international law side or legal side, this was a justly operation because the threat was coming from those areas to Turkish citizens. The second, the migration accumulation. Every country has a capacity, and Turkey, I think, used this capacity to the end. So that's why Turkey was right in that conducting the operations.
What followed in November 2024 took not only Syrians, but the whole world by surprise. Opposition forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HDS, formed in 2017. It was basically a merger of several armed groups within the aim of launching a definitive offensive against the Syrian regime. HDS had been in control of Idlib, an opposition stronghold in Syria's northwest, where it created the Syrian Salvation Government out of civilian technocrats. The HDS's final push against the regime was supported mainly by the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. They managed to seize control of Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. And as they advanced towards Damascus, Bashar al-Assad fled the capital on board a plane to Russia. Following his departure, victory was declared. HDS leader al-Shara was installed as the president of the new transitional government.
هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للامه الاسلاميه باكملها. هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للمنطقه.
The regime would not change if Turkey did not conduct those operations. We would be talking about the regime and a different future for Syria. I think Turkey's operations has the main significance for today's Syrian condition. If regime has changed, I think Turkey has the main role and player.
Turkey reaffirmed its support for Syria's recovery and the region's stability.
Yeni süreçte komşumuz Suriye'nin toparlanması, toprak bütünlüğünü
ve üniter yapısını koruması tüm etnik ve mezhebi unsurlarıyla huzura ermesi için elimizden gelen her türlü desteği sunmaya devam edeceğiz.
يعني هل تشك في أهمية العلاقة بين السلطة الجديدة وما بين تركيا؟ علاقة مهمة جدا، نحن كسوريين تربطنا بتركيا علاقات وثيقة جدا، ولا نريد أبدا أن تختل هذه العلاقة. العادات والتقاليد متقاربة، الأمور الاقتصادية نحن لا نريد أن نتخلى عن العلاقة الاقتصادية، ثم أنهم يعني ساعدونا كثيرا في فترات طويلة من بداية الثورة، الحليف الأكبر بالنسبة إلينا.
But a major obstacle stood ahead: Syria's reintegration into the international arena. The first step was to ease international sanctions.
When it comes to the key issue, the first thing that international governments need to do is a blanket lifting of sanctions on Syria. The regime is gone, the war is over, and the sanctions which still remain in place, rightly so at the time to punish the Assad regime, is now only punishing Syrians who want to rebuild their lives.
Ankara and Damascus initiated talks with the EU, the US, and Gulf states. On the 13th of May in Riyadh, US President Donald Trump's announcement brought a great relief to Syrians.
After discussing the situation in Syria with the Crown Prince, your Crown Prince, and also with President Erdogan of Turkey, who called me the other day and asked for a very similar thing, among others, and friends of mine, people that I have a lot of respect for in the Middle East, I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
Within days, the European Union and the UK followed suit.
Yesterday, the European Union announced the lifting of its economic sanctions on Syria. The UK revoked their previous sanctions regime last month.
The lifting of sanctions has opened the door for reconstruction. Türkiye responded with a $7 billion investment package focused on energy, housing, and essential infrastructure.
أتقدم بخالص الشكر والتقدير لفخامة الرئيس التركي رجب طيب أردوغان على دعوته الكريمة لزيارة جمهورية تركيا، وعلى الحفاوة والكرم اللذين عهدناهما من إخوتنا الأتراك. ولا شك أن الشعب السوري لن ينسى الوقفة التاريخية للدولة التركية مؤسسات وشعبا.
The new situation after Assad regime allows us to have more access and partner with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. Our activities will increase, will scale up, particularly in connection with this return trend. People are not only returning from Türkiye, also those people who have been spending their life in an IDP camp in the north, those camps that you visited, they are now returning back to their original villages as well. So they have new needs.
We do believe that the education system is the cornerstone of to raise Syria and to raise the Syrian level of economically, educationally, in all sectors. We do believe that this is the cornerstone of our work to focus on the young, on the children, to give them the opportunity to choose in the end.
Across Syria, people have returned to the streets, but not in protest. This time, in celebration, following the lifting of sanctions and hopes for a new future. From the rubble, Syrians are rebuilding, pursuing unity, recovery, and a lasting peace.
الحمد لله رب العالمين. هي يعني صار شرف الثورة المدينة درع البلد، واحنا بصراحة قلت لك بنفتخر بالشيء اللي عملناه، ما احناش ندمانين، ولكن قلت لك هي كانت الفرحة مقابلها قصة كبيرة اللي هي الشهداء واللي كانوا بالسجون صيرنا يعني. فالعبارة أنا اللي كتبتها أنا وسامر علي الصياصنة وأحمد ثاني رشيدة، والحمد لله رب العالمين انتصرنا، الحمد لله رب العالمين انتصرنا، وراح نعيش بأمن وأمان وبسلام.